Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with a worn cloth, the familiar smell of diesel fuel and motor oil filling her nostrils. At 28, she had spent nearly a decade working as a vehicle maintenance specialist at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often led newcomers to underestimate her. But Sarah could diagnose engine problems faster than most seasoned mechanics, and had earned the respect of every soldier who depended on her work. The morning sun cast long shadows across the motor pool as Sarah inspected a convoy of armored vehicles scheduled for a supply run to a remote outpost. Her methodical approach had saved countless lives over the years. Every bolt she tightened, every fluid level she checked, every worn part she replaced could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic breakdown in hostile territory. Sarah had never intended to become a soldier. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had learned to fix cars out of necessity when her single mother couldn't afford repair bills. What started as changing oil in their driveway had evolved into a natural talent for understanding how machines worked. When money for college ran short, the Army recruiter had painted a picture of technical training and stable income that seemed like a lifeline. But Afghanistan was nothing like the recruiter had described. The constant threat of roadside bombs, mortar attacks, and sniper fire had transformed her from a naive young woman into someone who could sleep through artillery barrages and work calmly while sirens wailed across the base. She had learned to carry her weapon everywhere, though she privately hoped she would never need to use it for anything other than qualifying at the range. The radio crackled to life in the maintenance bay, interrupting her thoughts. Command was requesting an immediate status update on Vehicle 7, a heavily armored transport that had been giving her trouble all week. The transmission kept slipping, and despite her best efforts, she hadn't been able to completely resolve the issue. Sarah grabbed her tools and headed toward the vehicle, knowing that half measures could get people killed. As she crawled under the massive truck, Sarah's mind wandered to the letter she had received from her younger brother the previous week. He was starting his senior year of high school and had been accepted to the state university on a partial scholarship. The pride in his voice during their last phone call had reminded her why she was here, sending most of her paycheck home to ensure he wouldn't have to make the same difficult choices she had faced. The sound of approaching footsteps made her slide out from under the vehicle. Sergeant First Class Johnson, the motor pool supervisor, was walking toward her with an expression she had learned to recognize over the years. Something was happening, and it wasn't routine maintenance. Johnson stopped beside the truck and lowered his voice even though they were alone in this section of the motor pool. Intelligence had intercepted communications indicating that a special operations team had gone missing during a reconnaissance mission in a particularly dangerous valley about 60 kilometers northeast of their position. The team had last been heard from 18 hours ago, and satellite imagery suggested they might have been captured or were hiding from a large enemy force. Sarah listened carefully as Johnson explained that a rescue operation was being hastily organized. Multiple units would be involved, including helicopters, ground forces, and close air support. Every available vehicle would be needed, which meant her maintenance schedule was about to become irrelevant. The mission commander wanted every truck, Humvee, and armored vehicle inspected and ready for immediate deployment within the next 4 hours. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a familiar burden. She knew that the men and women who would climb into these vehicles were depending on her expertise to bring them home safely. There would be no time for thorough diagnostics or proper part replacements. She would have to make quick decisions about what could be fixed, what could be temporarily patched, and what vehicles simply couldn't be trusted in combat. Johnson handed her a priority list and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with the largest workload of her deployment. She took a deep breath, tied her hair back more securely, and began the race against time that would change her life forever. In less than 4 hours, a convoy would roll out of the base carrying soldiers into harm's way, and every vehicle would bear her signature on its maintenance log. As Sarah began her systematic inspection of the motor pool, she had no way of knowing that Vehicle 7, the troublesome truck she had been working on all morning, would soon carry her into the most dangerous situation of her life. The mission that was being planned would require not just her mechanical skills, but courage she didn't know she possessed and decisions that would haunt her for years to come. The rescue operation briefing room buzzed with controlled urgency. as officers huddled over maps and communications equipment. Sarah found herself in an unfamiliar position, standing among infantry soldiers and special operations personnel as Lieutenant Colonel Harrison outlined the mission parameters. The missing team consisted of 4 Navy SEALs, who had been conducting surveillance on a suspected weapons cache when their communications went dark. Drone footage revealed the SEALs' last known position, in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills, dotted with caves and defensive positions. Intelligence estimates suggested that between 30 and 50 enemy fighters had converged on the area, likely alerted by local sympathizers. The terrain was treacherous with only one viable route for ground vehicles, making the rescue operation extremely dangerous. Sarah listened intently as the plan unfolded. 2 helicopter gunships would provide air support, while a ground convoy approached from the south. The convoy would consist of 12 vehicles carrying 42 soldiers, medics, and support personnel. Once they reached the valley, dismounted troops would advance on foot while the vehicles maintained a blocking position to prevent enemy reinforcements from arriving. The mission, Commander's eyes swept across the room before settling on Sarah. Her presence at the briefing was unusual, but Vehicle 7 had developed a complete transmission failure during final preparations. The backup vehicle wasn't armored heavily enough for the point position, and there simply wasn't time to transfer all the specialized communications equipment to another truck. The mission would have to proceed with Vehicle 7, which meant Sarah would need to accompany the convoy to monitor the transmission and make field repairs if necessary. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as the implications sank in. She had never been outside the wire on a combat mission, and the thought of riding in a vehicle that might break down in the middle of a firefight terrified her. But the lieutenant colonel made it clear that the mission couldn't wait. Every hour of delay increased the likelihood that the captured SEALs would be moved to a more secure location or killed. The convoy formation was explained in detail. Vehicle 7 would travel third in line, behind 2 heavily armored mine-resistant vehicles but ahead of the command and control truck. Sarah would ride in the passenger seat with her tools and spare parts, ready to perform emergency repairs under fire if necessary. The driver would be Corporal Williams, a steady veteran with multiple combat deployments who understood the mechanical limitations they would be working with. As the briefing concluded, Sarah gathered her equipment with shaking hands. She selected only the most essential tools, knowing that space and weight were critical factors. A basic socket set, pliers, electrical tape, spare fuses, and a small container of transmission fluid would have to suffice. Anything more complex would require getting under the vehicle, which would be impossible in a combat zone. The armory issued her additional ammunition for her rifle, body armor plates, and a communications headset. The weight of the equipment felt foreign and cumbersome compared to her usual work clothes, as she struggled with the unfamiliar buckles and straps. Sergeant Miller, the convoy's senior medic, helped her adjust the fit and explained the basic radio procedures she would need to know. Vehicle 7 rumbled to life as Sarah performed her final pre-mission inspection. The transmission fluid was clean, the levels were adequate, and she had bypassed the problematic sensor that had been causing the shifting issues. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it should hold together long enough to complete the mission. She whispered a quiet prayer to whatever mechanical gods might be listening and climbed into the passenger seat. Corporal Williams slid behind the wheel and performed his own pre-combat checks. Weapons loaded and secured, communications equipment tested, GPS coordinates programmed, and emergency medical supplies accounted for. The routine was familiar to him, but Sarah noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes constantly scanned for potential threats even while they were still inside the base perimeter. The convoy rolled toward the main gate as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the Afghan landscape. Sarah watched the familiar buildings of forward operating Base Thunder disappear behind them and tried to calm her racing heart. She had spent 2 years watching convoys leave and return, sometimes with empty seats and damaged vehicles that told stories she didn't want to imagine. Now she was part of one of those stories, riding toward an uncertain fate in a vehicle she wasn't entirely confident would make the journey. The radio chattered with position reports and status updates as the convoy spread out along the dusty road, each vehicle maintaining proper spacing to minimize casualties from roadside bombs. As they passed through the last checkpoint and entered genuinely hostile territory, Sarah realized that her comfortable world of scheduled maintenance and predictable problems was behind her. Ahead lay a valley where 4 American soldiers were fighting for their lives, depending on a rescue force that included a reluctant mechanic who had never fired her weapon in anger, and a truck held together by determination and improvised repairs. The convoy had been traveling for 90 minutes when the first signs of trouble appeared on the horizon. Smoke rose from a cluster of buildings in the distance, and the radio traffic became increasingly tense as forward scouts reported evidence of recent fighting. Vehicle 7's transmission continued to function, though Sarah could feel subtle vibrations through the floorboard that suggested the temporary repairs were being tested by the rough terrain. Corporal Williams navigated around potholes and debris with practiced skill, but each jarring impact sent waves of concern through Sarah's mind. The transmission fluid temperature was climbing steadily, and she knew that overheating would cause catastrophic failure within minutes. She monitored the gauges constantly while trying to watch for threats outside their armored windows. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the lead vehicle. Fresh tire tracks and disturbed earth suggested that enemy forces had recently moved heavy weapons into positions overlooking the main route. The convoy would need to take a longer detour through more difficult terrain to avoid a potential ambush. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the additional distance and rough roads would push Vehicle 7 beyond its mechanical limits. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came through the communication system with crisp authority. Intelligence had confirmed that the missing SEALs were being held in a compound at the far end of the valley, but enemy reinforcements were arriving hourly. The window for a successful rescue was closing rapidly, and the convoy couldn't afford delays for mechanical problems. Every vehicle would need to push forward regardless of minor issues. As they turned onto a narrow mountain path barely wide enough for their vehicles, Sarah felt Vehicle 7's transmission begin to slip more frequently. The temporary fix was failing under the stress of steep grades and constant gear changes. She quietly informed Corporal Williams about the deteriorating situation, and he adjusted his driving technique to minimize strain on the failing components. The convoy climbed higher into the rocky hills, each turn revealing more challenging terrain ahead. Sarah's tools rattled in their case as the vehicle lurched over loose stones and navigated switchbacks that seemed impossibly narrow for their massive armored truck. Through her window, she could see a drop-off that would be fatal if they slipped even slightly off the path. A sudden explosion echoed across the valley below, followed by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. The lead vehicles reported contact with enemy forces approximately 2 kilometers ahead of their position. The rescue had begun, but the convoy was still 20 minutes away from reaching the staging area where they would dismount and proceed on foot. Vehicle 7's engine temperature spiked as they climbed the steepest section of the mountain road. Sarah watched in growing alarm as multiple warning lights illuminated the dashboard. The transmission was overheating, the engine was struggling with the thin mountain air, and hydraulic pressure was dropping in the power steering system. Any one of these problems could stop them completely. Corporal Williams struggled to maintain control as the steering became increasingly difficult. Sarah grabbed her tools and began preparing for emergency repairs, though she knew that stopping on this exposed mountain road would make them sitting targets for enemy snipers. The radio chattered with reports of intensifying fighting ahead, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopter gunships engaging targets in the valley. The convoy commander's voice cut through the radio traffic with new orders. Enemy forces had been spotted moving to cut off their retreat route, and speed was now more critical than stealth. All vehicles were authorized to push their mechanical limits to reach the objective before they became trapped in the mountains. Sarah realized that her careful maintenance schedule and conservative operating procedures were about to be abandoned in favor of raw determination. As Vehicle 7 crested the final hill before the descent into the valley, Sarah could see the battlefield spread out below them. Smoke and dust marked the positions where American helicopters were engaging enemy fighters, while muzzle flashes from small arms fire twinkled like deadly stars among the rocks and buildings. The compound where the SEALs were being held sat in the middle of the chaos, surrounded by defensive positions that bristled with weapons. The transmission gave a violent shudder and began slipping badly as they started the steep descent toward the valley floor. Sarah made a desperate decision and reached under the dashboard to manually override the electronic controls. It was a dangerous modification that could destroy the transmission completely, but it might give them enough power to reach their destination. Vehicle 7 lurched forward with renewed strength as the manual override engaged. Corporal Williams fought to control their speed on the treacherous downhill grade, while Sarah monitored systems that were now operating far beyond their design limits. Behind them, the rest of the convoy followed in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke, racing toward a battle that would test every soldier's courage and skill. In the distance, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from what appeared to be a concentrated enemy position. Intelligence reports suggested that 40 enemy fighters had established defensive positions around the compound, and they had been preparing for this fight since capturing the SEALs. The convoy was driving into a carefully planned trap, but there was no turning back now. 4 American soldiers were depending on them, and mechanical failures would not be allowed to prevent their rescue. The valley floor erupted in chaos as the convoy reached the staging area. Vehicle 7's transmission was barely holding together, generating ominous grinding sounds that Sarah had never heard before in 15 years of working on mechanical systems. Steam rose from the engine compartment, and warning lights painted the dashboard in alarming shades of red and orange. Corporal Williams brought the massive truck to a stop behind a cluster of rocks that provided minimal cover from enemy fire. Immediately, soldiers began dismounting from the vehicles and taking defensive positions. Sarah could hear the sharp crack of sniper rifles and the heavy thump of rocket-propelled grenades exploding nearby. This was her first experience with actual combat, and the sensory overload was overwhelming. The convoy commander established a command post just 50 meters from Vehicle 7, and Sarah could hear radio communications describing the tactical situation. The SEALs were confirmed alive and being held in a fortified building at the center of the compound. Enemy fighters had established overlapping fields of fire from multiple positions, including several heavy machine gun nests and at least 2 mortar teams. Through her armored window, Sarah watched American soldiers advancing under fire toward the compound. The plan called for Vehicle 7 to remain in position as a communications relay and emergency evacuation platform, but the failing transmission meant they might not be able to move when the rescue force needed them most. The weight of potential consequences pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. A violent explosion rocked their position as an enemy mortar round landed just 20 meters away. Shrapnel peppered the armored hull of Vehicle 7, creating a sound like deadly hail striking metal. Sarah instinctively ducked below the window level, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear Corporal Williams shouting instructions into his radio. The transmission finally gave up, completely as Williams attempted to reposition the vehicle to avoid incoming fire. Vehicle 7 lurched forward a few meters before the grinding noise escalated to a metallic scream, and all forward momentum ceased. They were now immobilized in an active combat zone, with enemy fighters who knew exactly where they were located. Sarah grabbed her tools and told Williams she was going outside to attempt repairs. He looked at her as if she had lost her mind, pointing out that enemy snipers were actively engaging targets in their immediate area. But Sarah knew that without Vehicle 7, the rescue force would lose critical communications capability and might not be able to evacuate wounded soldiers or the rescued SEALs. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Sarah opened the passenger door and rolled out onto the rocky ground. The sound of gunfire was deafening without the protection of the armored hull, and she could hear bullets striking nearby rocks with sharp cracks that made her flinch involuntarily. She army-crawled toward the front of the vehicle, dragging her tool case behind her. The transmission housing was accessible through a panel on the underside of Vehicle 7, but reaching it would require her to lie on her back directly beneath the truck, while completely exposed to enemy fire. Corporal Williams provided covering fire with his rifle, while Sarah squeezed into the narrow space between the vehicle and the ground. Working by feel more than sight, Sarah began diagnosing the transmission failure. The main drive shaft had sheared completely, probably due to the stress of the mountain descent combined with her emergency override modifications. It was a catastrophic failure that would normally require hours of work in a properly equipped shop. But she might be able to create a temporary connection using spare parts and improvised solutions. Bullets struck the ground around Vehicle 7 with increasing frequency as enemy fighters zeroed in on their position. Sarah could hear Corporal Williams returning fire and calling for help on the radio, but most of the convoy's firepower was focused on the assault against the compound. She was essentially alone under a broken truck in the middle of a battlefield. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the assault team. They had breached the outer walls of the compound and were advancing toward the building where the SEALs were being held. But enemy resistance was heavier than expected. Casualties were mounting, and they would need immediate evacuation capability for wounded soldiers. Sarah's hands shook as she attempted to align the broken drive shaft components. The temporary repair would require her to hold several pieces in position, while simultaneously installing a makeshift coupling that might last for 10 minutes or might fail immediately. She had never attempted anything this complex under combat conditions, and the margin for error was essentially zero. An explosion much closer than before showered her with dirt and small rocks. Through the chaos, she could hear American soldiers shouting coordinates and calling for medical assistance. The battle for the compound was reaching its climax, and the success or failure of the entire mission might depend on whether she could get Vehicle 7 moving again. Sarah took a deep breath, said a prayer to whatever gods protected mechanics and desperate soldiers, and began the most important repair job of her life. Outside her limited field of vision, 40 enemy fighters were trying to kill the American Rescue Force. 4 Navy SEALs were depending on soldiers they had never met, and Corporal Williams was running low on ammunition, while trying to keep snipers from getting a clear shot at the woman lying beneath his truck. Working beneath Vehicle 7 while bullets whistled overhead, Sarah managed to create a temporary coupling using a spare universal joint and several hose clamps from her emergency kit. The repair was crude and would never pass inspection, but it might hold together long enough to get them moving again. Her hands were cut and bleeding from working with sharp metal edges in cramped conditions, but she barely noticed the pain over the adrenaline coursing through her system. Corporal Williams fired controlled bursts from his rifle, while providing Sarah with a running commentary on the tactical situation. The assault team had successfully breached the main building and located the 4 captured SEALs, but enemy fighters were launching a counterattack with everything they had. American casualties were mounting, and the convoy commander was already calling for immediate medical evacuation. The radio traffic revealed the desperate nature of their situation. Enemy reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions, and the rescue force would soon be outnumbered and surrounded. The window for extraction was closing rapidly, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood that the entire operation would end in disaster. Sarah emerged from beneath the vehicle covered in transmission fluid, dirt, and her own blood. She had done everything possible with the tools and parts available, but the temporary repair was held together more by hope than engineering principles. Vehicle 7 might move for 5 minutes or 5 hours. There was no way to predict how long the improvised fix would last under stress. As she climbed back into the passenger seat, a massive explosion rocked the compound. Enemy fighters had detonated a car bomb near the main gate, partially collapsing a wall and creating a debris field that would complicate the extraction. Through the smoke and chaos, Sarah could see American soldiers carrying wounded comrades toward the vehicles while maintaining suppressive fire against enemy positions. Williams started the engine and carefully engaged the transmission. Vehicle 7 lurched forward uncertainly, the makeshift coupling creating vibrations that rattled every loose component in the truck. But they were moving, and that was all that mattered. Williams navigated around craters and debris while Sarah monitored the mechanical systems that were now operating on borrowed time. The first group of evacuees reached their position just as enemy mortar rounds began falling with deadly accuracy. 4 soldiers carrying a badly wounded comrade threw themselves into the back of Vehicle 7 while Sarah and Williams provided covering fire through the gun ports. The injured soldier had taken shrapnel to his legs and chest, and the medic was working frantically to stop the bleeding while bullets struck their armored hull. More soldiers reached the vehicle as the enemy counterattack intensified. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen positions surrounding their small perimeter, and the sound of incoming fire was now constant. The rescue force was being systematically surrounded, and their only hope was to fight their way out before enemy reinforcements could close the trap completely. The radio crackled with the voice of the team leader who had found the captured SEALs. All 4 Navy personnel were alive but in poor condition after 18 hours of captivity. They could walk with assistance, but they would need immediate medical attention once they reached safety. The assault team was beginning their fighting withdrawal toward the vehicles, carrying wounded soldiers and protecting the rescued SEALs. Vehicle 7's transmission began making new and alarming sounds as Williams maneuvered to provide better cover for the approaching soldiers. Sarah realized that her repair was failing under the stress of combat maneuvering, and they might lose mobility completely within the next few minutes. She grabbed her rifle and prepared to dismount if necessary, knowing that staying with a disabled vehicle in this position would be suicide. The first of the rescued SEALs reached their vehicle, supported by 2 soldiers who had been fighting continuously for over an hour. The SEAL was conscious but clearly suffering from dehydration and injuries sustained during his capture. As they helped him into the back of Vehicle 7, Sarah could see the determination in his eyes despite his physical condition. Enemy fighters launched a desperate assault against the American perimeter, apparently recognizing that their prisoners were about to escape. The volume of incoming fire increased dramatically, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of heavy machine guns being brought to bear on their position. Several convoy vehicles had already taken significant damage, and at least 2 were immobilized with mechanical failures or battle damage. Through the chaos, Sarah spotted a group of enemy fighters maneuvering to attack Vehicle 7 from its most vulnerable angle. They were carrying rocket-propelled grenades and appeared to be positioning themselves for a direct assault on the truck's weakest armor. Without thinking about the consequences, Sarah grabbed her rifle and prepared to engage targets outside the vehicle. For the first time in her military career, the rescued SEALs and wounded soldiers in the back of Vehicle 7 depended on her mechanical skills to get them home safely, but now they also needed her to fight as an infantryman. The quiet mechanic who had spent 2 years avoiding combat was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything she cared about was at stake. Sarah opened the armored door of Vehicle 7 and stepped into the maelstrom of combat with her rifle raised. The enemy fighters advancing on their position were less than 50 meters away, close enough that she could see the determination in their faces and the weapons they carried. For a moment, time seemed frozen as she processed the reality that she was about to engage human targets for the first time in her life. Training took over as Sarah aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. Her first shot struck the lead enemy fighter center mass, dropping him instantly. The recoil felt familiar from countless hours on the firing range, but the knowledge that she had just killed another human being sent shockwaves through her system that no amount of training could have prepared her for. The remaining enemy fighters immediately shifted their focus to Vehicle 7, recognizing the threat from this unexpected direction. Bullets struck the armored hull around Sarah's position, forcing her to take cover behind the door while continuing to engage targets. Corporal Williams joined the fight from the driver's side, creating a crossfire that caught the enemy fighters in an untenable position. Inside the vehicle, the rescued SEALs and wounded soldiers could only listen to the battle raging outside, while hoping that Sarah and Williams could hold their position long enough for the extraction to succeed. The most seriously injured soldier was losing consciousness despite the medic's efforts, and every minute of delay reduced his chances of survival. Sarah's rifle ran empty after engaging multiple targets, and she performed her first combat reload while crouched behind the armored door. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, but her mind was reeling from the violence she had witnessed and participated in. The enemy fighters were regrouping for another assault, and she could see additional muzzle flashes from positions throughout the compound. The convoy commander's voice cut through the radio chatter with new orders. Intelligence had confirmed that a large enemy force was approaching their position and would arrive within 10 minutes. All vehicles needed to begin immediate extraction regardless of their condition, or the entire rescue force would be overrun and destroyed. Vehicle 7's transmission chose that moment to begin its final death throes. The makeshift coupling Sarah had installed was disintegrating under the stress of combat maneuvering, and Williams reported that they were losing power rapidly. Within minutes, they would be completely immobilized in a position that was already being targeted by enemy mortars and heavy weapons. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She told Williams to begin moving toward the extraction route regardless of mechanical failure, while she remained outside the vehicle to provide covering fire for the soldiers still approaching their position. It was essentially a suicide mission, but the wounded men inside Vehicle 7 needed to reach medical care, and the rescued SEALs had endured too much to die in the final moments of their rescue. As Vehicle 7 lurched forward on its failing transmission, Sarah ran alongside while engaging enemy targets that were trying to stop the evacuation. Her accurate rifle fire forced several enemy fighters to take cover, buying precious seconds for other soldiers to reach safety. But she knew that her ammunition was limited, and eventually the enemy would overwhelm her position through sheer numbers. The last group of American soldiers reached the vehicle just as Sarah's rifle clicked empty for the second time. She had no more ammunition, and enemy fighters were advancing from multiple directions with the clear intent of overrunning the American position. Vehicle 7 was moving, but barely, and the transmission was making sounds that indicated complete failure was imminent. William slowed the truck just enough for Sarah to grab onto the rear bumper and pull herself up onto the back deck. Enemy bullets struck the armor around her as she struggled to maintain her grip, while the vehicle lurched and swayed over the rough terrain. Through the rear window, she could see the faces of the men she had helped rescue, and their expressions of gratitude gave her the strength to hold on. Despite the overwhelming fatigue and terror, Vehicle 7's transmission finally surrendered completely as they reached the edge of the compound. Williams managed to coast the massive truck behind a rocky outcropping that provided some protection from enemy fire, but they were still several hundred meters from the extraction point where helicopters were waiting to evacuate the wounded. The other vehicles in the convoy were already moving toward the landing zone, carrying their own loads of wounded soldiers and rescued personnel. Sarah realized that Vehicle 7 would need to be abandoned, and everyone inside would have to make the final approach on foot while under fire from the pursuing enemy force. As she helped transfer the wounded soldiers from the disabled vehicle, Sarah caught sight of the enemy fighters who had been pursuing them. At least 40 armed men were advancing across the compound, firing as they moved and clearly intent on preventing the American escape. The final phase of the rescue operation would require every person to fight, regardless of their training or previous experience. Sarah picked up a rifle from one of the wounded soldiers and checked its ammunition count. She had never imagined that her deployment would end with her standing in an Afghan valley, preparing to fight for her life alongside Navy SEALs and infantry soldiers. But the quiet mechanic who had started the day worried about transmission repairs was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The final 400 meters to the helicopter landing zone became a running firefight as Sarah and the remaining soldiers carried wounded comrades while engaging the pursuing enemy force. The rescued SEALs, despite their poor condition, picked up weapons and joined the defensive effort with the skill and determination that had made them legends among special operations forces. Sarah found herself moving and fighting alongside men she had only heard about in stories. The SEALs moved with a fluid precision that seemed almost supernatural, placing accurate fire while advancing under pressure and coordinating their actions without apparent communication. Despite 18 hours of captivity and abuse, they fought with the intensity of fresh troops defending their homeland. Helicopter gunships appeared overhead and began engaging the enemy fighters with devastating effect. The sound of their cannons was deafening, but Sarah had never heard anything more beautiful in her life. Explosions bloomed among the enemy positions as the pilots methodically destroyed the heavy weapons that had been targeting the American force. The evacuation helicopters sat on a small, flat area surrounded by low hills, their rotors turning and engines running as they waited for the rescue force to arrive. Sarah could see medical personnel preparing stretchers and emergency equipment, ready to treat the wounded soldiers who had paid such a high price for this mission. As they approached the landing zone, one of the rescued SEALs stumbled and fell. Sarah immediately moved to help him, discovering that he had been hiding a serious leg wound throughout the firefight. Without hesitation, she slung her rifle and helped carry him toward the waiting aircraft, while other soldiers provided covering fire against the few remaining enemy fighters. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency despite the chaos surrounding them. Wounded soldiers were loaded first, followed by the rescued SEALs and finally the remaining members of the rescue force. Sarah found herself assigned to the last helicopter, still carrying the rifle she had used in combat and wearing body armor that showed multiple bullet impacts. As their helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, Sarah looked down at the compound where Vehicle 7 sat abandoned among the rocks and debris. The truck that had carried them through the most dangerous mission of the war was now just another piece of military equipment left behind in a foreign land. But it had served its purpose, delivering American soldiers to safety and bringing 4 captured SEALs home to their families. The flight back to Forward Operating Base Thunder passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Sarah sat among soldiers who had shared the most intense experience of their lives. Men who had seen her transition from a reluctant mechanic into someone who had fought with courage and skill when everything depended on her performance. News of the successful rescue operation spread quickly through the base, and Sarah found herself receiving congratulations from soldiers who had previously known her only as the quiet woman who fixed their vehicles. The story of how she had repaired Vehicle 7 under fire and then fought alongside infantry soldiers and Navy SEALs became part of the unit's legend. But Sarah struggled with the transformation she had undergone during those crucial hours. The skills she had developed and the actions she had taken in combat felt foreign to the person she had been that morning. She had killed enemy fighters, made life or death decisions under pressure, and discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. The rescued SEALs made a point of visiting Sarah before they were evacuated to a medical facility in Germany. Their quiet words of gratitude meant more to her than any official recognition or medal. These were men who understood the cost of combat and the value of courage under fire, and their respect validated the choices she had made during the most difficult day of her life. In the weeks that followed, Sarah returned to her duties in the motor pool, but she was no longer the same person who had worried about transmission repairs and routine maintenance schedules. She had learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being terrified. Vehicle 7 was eventually recovered from the valley and returned to the base for evaluation. The transmission was completely destroyed, and the makeshift repairs Sarah had performed under fire were studied by military engineers who marveled at her ingenuity and resourcefulness. The truck was retired from service, but not before becoming a symbol of the determination and skill that had made the rescue mission possible. Sarah completed her deployment and returned to Texas, where she used her military training and GI Bill benefits to start her own automotive repair business. But she never forgot the day when 40 enemy fighters stood between her and 4 captured Americans, and how an unlikely combination of mechanical skill and personal courage had made the difference between success and tragedy. Years later, when customers brought their broken vehicles to her shop, Sarah would sometimes pause while working under a car and remember the weight of responsibility she had felt lying beneath Vehicle 7 in that Afghan valley. The routine repairs and maintenance that filled her days seemed almost trivial compared to the life or death mechanical work she had performed under enemy fire. Her younger brother graduated from university and became an engineer, never knowing that his sister's courage in combat had ensured his education would be completed. Sarah had kept the details of that day largely to herself, preferring to let others tell the story of the rescue mission while she focused on building a new life in civilian society. The 4 Navy SEALs she had helped rescue all survived their injuries and returned to duty. One of them, Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, made a point of stopping by her shop during a visit to Texas several years after the deployment. He brought his family to meet the woman who had risked everything to bring him home, and his young daughter shook Sarah's grease-stained hand with the solemnity of someone who understood she was meeting a hero. On quiet evenings in her garage, Sarah would sometimes hold the wrench she had used to make those desperate repairs, and reflect on how a single day had changed her understanding of what she was capable of accomplishing. She had entered the military as a young woman looking for technical training and steady income, but she had discovered reserves of strength and courage that she never knew existed. The official after-action report credited the success of the rescue mission to superior planning, effective air support, and the exceptional performance of all personnel involved. But Sarah knew that the real story was simpler and more profound. Sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and the measure of their character is determined by how they respond when everything depends on their actions. Vehicle 7 was eventually displayed in a military museum, with a plaque describing its role in the successful rescue of 4 captured Navy SEALs. Visitors could read about the mechanical challenges overcome during the mission, but they could never truly understand the weight of responsibility that Sarah Martinez had carried that day, or the courage required to crawl under a broken truck while enemy bullets struck the ground around her. The woman who had once worried about disappointing her supervisor with late maintenance. Reports had learned that real Strength comes not from avoiding difficult situations, but from finding the determination to succeed when failure would cost lives. In a single day of combat, Sarah Martinez had discovered who she truly was beneath the quiet exterior, and that knowledge would guide her for the rest of her life.